Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our publishing and coaching services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Aaron Fischer, who is an executive ghostwriter. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I just want to say I've been listening to your show for a while, and I love it. You bring in such a great, eclectic sort of cast of authors, and it's really great the way that you suss out everyone's wisdom. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We want to have as much diversity on the show as possible, so we love to interview authors, ghostwriters, editors, and just get a lot of great knowledge out of it. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation that you and I are going to have today.
Excited to be here.
All right, well, I'll tell you what, let's get started. So what is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
So I think that a lot of the authors that you have on your show talk about the importance of planning ahead. And I think they're absolutely correct. Usually what they're talking about is the importance of getting thoughtful about whom you're writing for, what you plan to say, how you plan to roll out the book, and eventually developing an outline for the book. I think that there is a stage of planning that comes before that stage. And that's where you look at the it's a meta planning stage, where you look at the entire process of writing a book and give some consideration to what are the elements that are going into this project, how much mastery do I bring to each element, and where am I going to need the most support. So some of the elements I'm talking about are content, that's your message, what you want to tell people, language, structure, style, that's how you're going to communicate your message, how effectively you can communicate it. Then there's formatting, there's publishing, and there's marketing. So for each of those elements, people are going to bring in different levels of mastery. If you just completed your doctorate in English, you're going to have a really strong handle on language and style and structure. Probably you're going to have really strong content. You might need more support when it comes to publishing and marketing. By contrast, if you are a professional of some kind, so I'm a ghostwriter, so I work with executives, I work with physicians, I work with philanthropists and artists and designers, and so they bring in extraordinary content. They have so much to share, and they often are very knowledgeable about the marketing process, but where they need the most support is in areas like language and style and structure and the publishing process. And for each of those areas where you need support, the next question becomes, how much is this going to matter to me? A few of my clients are retirees who are realizing a lifelong dream of writing a book. And for them, there's not a lot of overhead. The stakes are pretty low. And so muddling through feels like a compelling option. And muddling is really great. Muddling is the way that we get experience and develop expertise. If you are a professional, then muddling may not be the best strategy for you, because this book is going to have higher overhead in terms of time and money, the number of hours you put into the book and your hourly rate. If you combine those figures, that's how much this book is going to cost you. And also in terms of quality, it's really going to be, the stakes are going to be high. It's important that this be an excellent book, because it's going to be a huge part of your brand identity. And so for those people, the areas where they need support, they really need support, and they need to find people who are experts. When people ask me about that, I'll usually direct them, if they need help with structure, I'll direct them to a book coach. If they need help with language and style, I'll work with them as a ghostwriter and a copy editor. If they need help with formatting, I'll forward them to a proofreader. If they need help with publishing and marketing, I'll forward them to a publishing consultant like you, I believe. And so that's my key piece of advice, is be really thoughtful about what your strengths are and where you're going to need support and how much that support matters to you.
Absolutely. One of the points that I like that you brought up was working with retirees. I also have several clients that are in that same boat as well. And you're right. The main thing that they're focused on is their legacy, because people don't live forever. but books potentially can, because I think Amazon will most likely outlive just about all of us, and they really want to have that legacy and something that they can share for generations.
That's exactly right. And so if that is your project, then there is an incredible opportunity for you to really invest time into this process and to really develop the experience and find your way to the book that you want to leave behind. Whereas if you are sort of in your peak working phase, then you're not going to have a lot of time to offer. And so it's going to be important to do it quickly and for it to be done expertly immediately. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's going to transition nicely into our next question, and that is, what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published, about the process?
So I think what's really hard for a lot of my clients is what happens in the copy editing phase. And that's because the time comes where you have to say goodbye to some of your material. I think it's important to know that whenever you go into writing a book, or really any project, I'm sure anyone listening has had experience with this, you often, when you begin a project, there are infinite possibilities, and there's a sort of a sense that every outcome is a viable outcome, and that's really exciting. When you actually, once you're in the middle of the project, you discover that you have seriously limited the number of possibilities, and the outcome becomes pretty fixed. I think when we begin writing a book, we often sort of imagine that we can go from point A to point everything else. And by the time you're in copy editing, you're discovering that really this book goes from point A to point Q. And maybe my next book can go from point A to point B, but not this book. And having the courage to say goodbye to material or to put stuff in a drawer that can come back out another time can be really challenging. So I just recommend coming to the project with an open mind and a willingness to discover that this book might not be what you expected it to be.
Well, let's talk a little bit about marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in book launches that you feel has worked well.
Sure. So I've heard, I think a number of your guests in the past have talked about the importance of being really thoughtful about who your target is, whom you're writing for, and how you plan to reach them. And that how you plan to reach them is really the next step once you figure out your target. I used to manage new business ventures for a marketing firm, and we worked with clients like Microsoft and Universal Studios and the NASDAQ, and we really specialized in live engagement. And our sort of internally, our motto was that we reach people where they live, where they work, and where they play. I think that things like digital marketing are really strong tools, but there is no replacement for live engagement. When we talk about marketing, we often think about quantity and quality of an impression. An impression is someone's interaction with your brand or your product. So in this case, we'd say with you and your book. Print marketing, digital marketing, these are really great quantitative strategies. But when it comes to quality engagement, you really want to meet people in person. And you do that where your target audience lives, where they work, and where they play. And by engaging with them in person, you're going to create a really deep relationship with your target, and that hopefully you will be able to convert those people into evangelists for you and your brand.
So with live engagement, you're mainly talking about local events, is that correct?
Absolutely, hyper-local. So, if you're writing for the Wall Street crowd, then the answer to where they play is probably bars around Wall Street at happy hour. And how can you put yourself there? Is it sponsoring a happy hour? When it comes to sponsoring, often what we'll do is we'll look at expos and conferences. Is there a way to sponsor a conference, become a speaker, bring your book to the conference so that you can shake hands and look people in the eye and tell them about you and your brand so that they can pass on the message for you and pass on your book for you.
So like conferences, meetups, different things like that.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, that's a great strategy, especially if you're in a larger area, metropolitan-wise, where you can go out there and do that. Because I'm in the Dallas area, so there's always lots of opportunities here throughout the multiple cities that we have in the Metroplex and some of the larger markets too. It's a great way to have that engagement. Do you have any engagement strategies for people that are wanting to reach out via the internet, via Facebook Lives or Instagram? Any suggestions with that?
You know, I would actually turn that question back on you, Paul, because a lot of you ask your guests this very often, but I don't know that I've ever had the opportunity to hear what you think. Are there particularly strong digital strategies that you've discovered?
Mainly it's just building a connection. Actually, the previous interview that I did, we were talking about that, and actually not only doing posts, but also utilizing the power of direct messages, especially in Instagram and with Facebook as well, and just connecting to those people on a different level versus just having your post out there and worrying about likes or comments, but actually reaching out to people that you're connected with, that are followers, that are friends on Facebook, for instance, and actually reaching out that way and building relationships. Because you're absolutely right when you talk about that live engagement where people want to connect with you and they want to be part of something that's bigger. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, absolutely. This is why I love talking to, is it right to call you a publishing consultant? Would that be accurate?
I believe that's very fair.
So this is, I just find, so I'm a ghostwriter and a copy editor, so I handle the structure and the language, and then I pass it off to someone else. And so when I talk to publishing consultants, it's just really exciting to learn what they've discovered.
Well, and the nice thing is you are my 145th episode that we've done. And the great thing about this show is we get to learn so many things. And for those that are actually listening to this episode for the first time, check out the previous 144 episodes because we have a lot of great content through having these conversations because there, as you mentioned, there's so many great strategies. And I love the fact that you've been talking about live engagement locally because I think that's one of the biggest things that gets missed is that people think they can just do all the marketing on the internet. And yes, it's a part of it, absolutely, with social media, but it's also making those connections, and whether it's being in a local chamber of commerce or a Rotary Club or just meetup events and networking events. There are just so many great opportunities, and I feel that a lot of people are really missing that local approach.
Yeah, and I think you were talking about direct messaging, and they're birds of a feather, right? They're both about creating quality engagements with individuals so that your impressions cut deep. They're not just broad, but they really have real depth to them.
Absolutely. Well, Aaron, let's talk about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Sure. It's a funny question. I think that if a writer can tell you definitively what their favorite book is, either they're not a writer or it's not their favorite book because there's so much great stuff out there.
True.
And if I try to list my favorite, it would just go on forever. But what I could do is I could offer a recommendation for your readers. A book that I think is really helpful when you're jumping into the writing process. I talked about this a little bit earlier. Most of the people whom I work with bring a lot of content to the table. They don't know as much about language and style and structure. And a book that I think is a really helpful sort of crash course in that is by Francine Prose, and I think it's called Reading Like a Writer. What she does in this book, there are a lot of books that are about how to write, and they're very prescriptive. And I think that's kind of bogus because there's not one way to write. There aren't rules of writing. There are conventions, and a writer is strategic about which conventions they abide by and which ones they violate, and how those choices create their voice. So I think prescriptive writing books aren't helpful, but Francine Prose's book is descriptive. What she does is she brings in excerpts that she loves, from other writers. And she breaks down what they're doing and why it's effective. And she isn't saying, here's one way to write. Instead, she's saying, look at all of these different approaches, all these different ways of writing, and what can you learn from them? And also, more importantly, what can you learn from that analytical process of looking at the way that she reads, so that you can bring those same tools to your own reading and also your writing. It's particularly helpful for me as a ghostwriter because my job is to sort of disguise myself in other people's voices. And so I have to, whether I'm listening to them or reading them, figure out where are their pauses and their commas, where are their stops and their periods, when is an aside a parenthetical, and when does it use em dashes. In reading like a writer, I seem to recall that each chapter deals with a different element of writing style. So like there will be a chapter on sentences and a chapter on paragraphs, and she really gets into the nitty-gritty of how different authors approach them. So please write this down. Please check it out. It's called Reading Like a Writer by Francine Prose.
I already wrote it down myself. That sounds like a great book to check out, and especially for those that are really passionate about writing and people that might want to potentially become ghostwriters. Because one thing that I've noticed, it takes a very special person with a highly formed skill set to be a ghostwriter, because it is definitely a very unique field, and I think it's also a very challenging field, but you have to have that right mindset.
Yeah, it's a real joy, and I know for me it sort of began as having an ear and sort of hearing the way that people talk and the way that people write, but over the years it's become more about getting really technical about it and noticing, this person paragraphs in a really unusual way, and it's a lot of fun to crack that code and start using it. It's a good sort of game of masks and disguises.
Well, for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
Sure. There is Alan Watts was a philosophy scholar. I think he calls himself something like a philosophical entertainer, which, if you know Alan Watts, is classic Alan Watts. But he said, this isn't quite the way he put it, but he said something to the effect that any certainly known future is an event of which we can say that you've already had it. It's already passed. When we play chess, as soon as the outcome of the game becomes certain, we cancel the game, we wipe the board clean, and we begin a new one, because the whole zest of the thing is that you don't know what's going to happen next. This is something that he said in a lecture series, and I just love that because I think it's true about life, and I think it's true. I'll stick to writing for now and not go to life. I talked before about the importance of sort of keeping an open mind. The outcome of writing this book is going to take you in all sorts of surprising directions. It's going to create relationships that you never expected. If it involves research, you're probably going to learn a lot more than you ever expected. And the final product is going to look very different from what you imagined. And it's really important to remember as you begin the journey, it's really important to remember that the joy of it is the discovery of what that final product is going to be. It's not realizing some sort of predetermined outcome.
Absolutely. Well, Aaron, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Yeah, I'd say just go ahead and reach out. If you need advice, if you need a referral, I am happy to refer. And if you're looking for a ghostwriter or a copy editor, I'd be happy to help you or explore what that might look like. You can email me at writerofprose@gmail.com. That's writerofprose@gmail.com.
Well, Aaron, I want to thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thanks so much, Paul. I really enjoyed being here.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how to get your book published with a proven system that works, grab a free copy of my book at getpublishedpodcast.com.